Grandma, I have to tell you something. I sold that old jewelry of yours. I got $80,000. We're rich. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, smelling of my grandson's cheap cologne. The grandfather clock in the hall seemed to stop ticking, its silence a heavy blanket over the proud, feverish smile on his face. What he didn't know was that my silence wasn't shock. It was calculation. What I did next taught him the true cost of betrayal. So stay with me until the end. Please subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether it's from your city, your job, or even the comfort of your own couch. My name is Evelyn Schneider, and at 72, I've learned that the quietest moments are often the loudest. I live in Lititz, Pennsylvania, in a fieldstone house my grandparents built with their own German hands. For 40 years, I was a restorer of antique furniture, a trade that teaches you to see through layers of cheap paint to the honest wood beneath. It's a skill that, I was about to discover, applies to people just as well as it does to an old rocking chair. My life runs on a simple, predictable rhythm, governed by the rising sun and the scent of lavender and beeswax that permeates every room of this old, sturdy house. My mornings always begin the same way, with the gurgle of the coffee maker and the weight of a warm ceramic mug in my hands as I watch the fog burn off the farmlands. My home is my sanctuary, a museum of my own making where every object holds a story. The worn armchair in the corner was the first piece my late husband, Arthur's, and I bought together. The collection of opera records was my father's. Everything has its place, its history, its soul. It is a life of serene order, one I built carefully over the decades to keep the chaos of the world at bay. My only real connection to that outside world, my only weak spot, is my grandson, Ryan. He's 22. Since Arthur passed, I've poured all the love I had left into that boy. I saw him as the future, the continuation of the Schneider line. I paid for his college courses, overlooked his casual disregard for his studies, and dismissed the glint of selfishness in his eyes as simple youthful immaturity. I spoiled him. I know that now. I chose to see the boy he was, not the man he was becoming, because the truth was too painful to accept. That Sunday shattered my carefully constructed peace. The air was thick with the promise of a summer storm, and the hydrangeas in my garden were heavy with unopened buds. Ryan arrived unannounced, his energy frantic, almost feverish. He paced my living room, unable to stand still, his eyes darting around at the old furniture as if seeing it for the first time not as family history, but as a price list. And then he said it, with a proud smile that never touched his eyes. "Grandma, I have to tell you something. I took that old jewelry of yours, and I sold it. I got $80,000. We're rich." The confession was a physical blow. It felt like a shard of ice lodging itself in my chest, stealing my breath. It wasn't about the money. $80,000 is just paper. It was the raw, unvarnished betrayal. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had taken my mother's memories, gifts from a great-grandfather he'd never met, a legacy of love passed down through generations of women who endured hardships he couldn't possibly imagine. And he stood there, flaunting the desecration as if he'd won the lottery. The pain was dizzying, a sudden, sharp realization that to him, I was just a lockbox to be emptied. He expected tears. He probably anticipated a dramatic scene, maybe some shouting, followed by my eventual forgiveness, as had always been the pattern. But he got none of that. I simply looked at him, my restorer's eye taking in every detail, the slight tremor in his hand not from fear but from adrenaline, the expensive new watch on his wrist that I hadn't seen before, the way he avoided looking directly at the cedar-lined chest in my bedroom, visible from the doorway. He was a poorly made replica of a man, and I had been admiring the cheap veneer for far too long. In that crushing silence, my grief began to crystallize into something else, something cold and hard and clear. It was a feeling I knew well from my workshop, the moment of decision before making the first, irreversible cut into a piece of wood. Ryan, in his arrogant euphoria, was completely oblivious. He saw a fragile old woman, a sentimental fool lost in her memories. He had no idea that the woman he was looking at was the same one who could spend 100 hours meticulously restoring a single inlaid drawer. A woman whose greatest asset was not her love, but her monastic patience. He started talking again, his voice a grating buzz in the quiet room. He listed all the things he was going to buy with our money. A sports car, a new apartment in the city, a trip to Europe. He painted a picture of a grand future built on the ashes of my past. I listened, my face a placid mask, but inside, a lifetime of love was curdling into something that felt dangerously close to contempt. He was so caught up in his fantasy that he failed to notice my reaction wasn't one of sorrow, but of a quiet, chilling assessment. He had just handed me all the proof I ever needed. My mind drifted back to a memory from years ago. Ryan was about 10, and I was trying to teach him how to properly sand a small tabletop. He was impatient, pressing too hard, leaving ugly scratches in the grain. "Patience, Ryan," I had told him. "You have to respect the material. You can't force it." He'd thrown the sandpaper down in frustration and walked away. He hadn't changed at all. He still saw no value in things that required patience, respect, or work. He only saw the quickest path to the shiniest object, no matter what he had to destroy to get it. I thought about the jewelry itself, the heavy gold locket with my grandmother's initials, worn smooth by her touch. Inside were tiny, faded portraits of her and my grandfather on their wedding day. I remembered her telling me how he had saved for 2 years to buy it for her. The sapphire earrings my Arthur gave me on our first anniversary, the color of his eyes. Each piece was a chapter in my family's story, a tangible link to the people who made me who I am. To Ryan, they were just meltable gold and sellable stones. The pressure in the room became unbearable. It wasn't just his presence. It was the weight of my own foolishness pressing down on me. How had I been so blind? The signs were all there. The unexplained cash. The increasingly flimsy excuses for needing more money for college. The way his friends looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. I had ignored it all, choosing the comfort of a beautiful lie over the ugliness of the truth. My love for him had become a layer of cheap varnish, and he had finally scratched it away. He finally seemed to notice my silence, and his bravado wavered for just a second. "Aren't you happy, Grandma? This is a good thing. We don't have to worry about money anymore." The word "we" was the cruelest cut of all. There was no "we." There was only him and his greed. And me, the obstacle he had just cleared. He saw my home, my life's work, my memories, as a resource to be plundered for his own convenience. The realization settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, devastating finality. The scent of lemon oil and beeswax, usually a comfort, now seemed cloying. The familiar ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a countdown. My sanctuary had been breached, not by a stranger, but by my own blood. Every restored object in the room, a testament to my ability to see and resurrect value, now felt like a monument to my greatest failure. I had successfully preserved the past, but I had utterly failed to protect the future from the predator I had raised within these very walls. I felt a profound, bottomless loneliness. It was different from the quiet solitude I had cherished since Arthur's death. That was a peaceful state, filled with memory and love. This was an active, gnawing emptiness. It was the loneliness of betrayal, the chilling knowledge that the person you love most in the world sees you as nothing more than a means to an end. The illusion of family, the one thing I had clung to, had just evaporated, leaving me utterly alone in a house full of ghosts. He was still talking, but his voice had faded into a meaningless drone. My focus sharpened on one thing, the large, ornate key that sat on the mantelpiece. It was the key to the old cedar chest in my bedroom, the chest he thought he had emptied. He was so proud of his cleverness, so sure of my naivete. He had no idea that some treasures are protected not by locks and keys, but by wisdom and foresight. He thought he had played me, but he had only played himself. The feeling of being trapped was immense, but the walls closing in weren't the walls of my home. It was the prison of my own heart. I was cornered by my love for the grandson I thought I had, and my disgust for the man standing in front of me. To confront him now would be to start a war I wasn't sure I could win. To stay silent would be to condone his theft, to let him believe he had gotten away with destroying our family's legacy for a down payment on a sports car. A strange calm washed over me, the kind that comes when you've lost everything and have nothing left to fear. The grief was still there, a cold, heavy stone in my gut, but it was now accompanied by a sliver of steely resolve. He had underestimated me. Everyone always had. They saw the quiet widow, the gentle old woman who fixed chairs. They didn't see the woman who could strip a life's worth of neglect down to its barest truth and patiently, methodically, begin the work of restoration. My gaze drifted past him, to my own reflection in the dark, polished wood of a china cabinet. I saw the lines on my face, the weariness in my eyes, but I also saw a flicker of something else, something I hadn't seen in a very long time. It was the look of a woman who knew the difference between what is priceless and what is merely expensive. He had made his move, blinded by greed. Now, it was my turn. And I would be neither blind nor sentimental. I remembered a conversation with Arthur years ago when we were drawing up our wills. He had worried about the family heirlooms. "You have to protect them, Evie," he had said. "Not just from thieves, but from fools." At the time, I thought he was being overly dramatic. Now, his words echoed in my mind like a prophecy. I had been foolish, but I had not been entirely unprepared. A plan I had made with my lawyer years ago, a just-in-case measure, suddenly felt less like paranoia and more like providence. Ryan finally ran out of steam. He stood there, looking at me expectantly, waiting for my applause, my approval. He wanted me to validate his crime, to tell him he was smart, that he had done the right thing. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I could feel the coming storm in the air, the pressure dropping. It was a perfect metaphor for the moment. The calm before the lightning strike. He had no idea the storm he had unleashed was not in the sky, but right here in this room. I felt encurralado, trapped between a devastating past and an uncertain future. The path forward was a fog. Do I call the police and ruin his life? And by extension, what was left of mine? Do I confront him with the truth about the fake jewelry and watch his selfish world crumble? Or do I let him walk away with his tainted money and simply cut him out of my life like a cancer? Each option felt like a different kind of defeat, a different kind of heartbreak. The quiet, orderly life I had known was over. He had burned it to the ground with his careless greed. The Evelyn Schneider who woke up this morning, who found peace in the familiar scent of coffee and the gentle strains of an old opera record, was gone. He had murdered her for $80,000. And in her place stood someone else, someone colder, clearer, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who understood that the most valuable things are not kept in a box, but in your head. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the lukewarm cup of coffee on the end table. I took a slow sip, the bitter taste grounding me. My mind was a whirlwind of pain, anger, and a terrifyingly clear sense of purpose. I had to make a decision. Not as a grandmother, but as the guardian of a legacy. He had turned our family history into a commodity, and in doing so, he had forfeited his place in it. I looked at him, really looked at him, one last time. I saw the boy I had bounced on my knee, the teenager I had taught to drive, and the young man who had just gutted me without a second thought. All three were the same person. I had just refused to see it. The confusion began to lift, replaced by a stark, painful clarity. I knew what I had to do. It would be the hardest thing I had ever done, harder than burying my husband. He shifted his weight, impatient. "Well, say something, Grandma." I slowly placed the coffee cup back on its saucer, the small click echoing in the silent room. I raised my eyes to meet his, and for the first time, I let him see the ice in them. The loving, doting grandmother was gone. A matriarch was in her place. "Sit down, Ryan," I said, my voice low and steady, without a trace of the tremor I felt in my soul. "We need to talk about the real jewelry." Ryan's triumphant smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He sank into the armchair opposite me, the one Arthur used to sit in, and the sight sent a fresh pang through my chest. The leather groaned under his weight as he leaned forward, a nervous energy now radiating from him. "What do you mean? The real jewelry. I just told you. I sold it. All of it. The locket, the earrings, that big brooch with the blue stone. $80,000, Grandma." He said the number again as if it were a magic word, a shield against whatever was coming next. He was still trying to control the narrative, to keep his fantasy alive. I let the silence hang for a moment longer, allowing his words to dissolve into the heavy, storm-laden air. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My quiet was more potent than any shout could ever be. "Ryan," I began, my tone even and measured, like the slow, deliberate stroke of a fine grit sandpaper. "The jewelry you took from the cedar chest, the pieces you sold, they were replicas. Exquisite fakes, I admit, but fakes nonetheless. I had them made almost 10 years ago." His face went blank, the gears in his mind grinding to a halt as he tried to process what I had just said. He let out a short, sharp laugh, but it was brittle, hollow. "That's not funny, Grandma? What are you talking about? Fakes? I had them appraised. The guy said they were real." He was grasping at straws, his voice rising in pitch. He looked around the room, at the solid, unyielding furniture, as if seeking confirmation that the world was still as he understood it. But everything in that room, every piece I had ever restored, was a testament to my ability to distinguish the genuine from the imitation. He should have known better. I thought of the day I'd commissioned the copies. It was shortly after Arthur passed. I was sitting in this very room, cataloging our life together, feeling the profound vulnerability of being alone. My lawyer, a sensible man named Mr. Albright, had advised me to secure my most valuable assets. But it was Arthur's voice I heard in my head, his gentle warning about protecting our legacy not just from thieves, but from fools. I realized then that the greatest threat might not come from a stranger breaking a window, but from someone who felt entitled to what was inside. So, I took a trip to Philadelphia. I found a master craftsman, a man who understood the art of historical reproduction. I sat with him for hours, explaining the intricate details of each piece, providing him with photographs and my own detailed sketches. It cost a small fortune, but I saw it as an insurance policy, not just on the items themselves, but on the memories they held. The real heirlooms were then placed in a secure deposit box at the bank in Lancaster, where they have remained, untouched and safe, ever since. Ryan was shaking his head, a vein throbbing in his temple. "No, you're lying. You're just saying that because you're mad. You're trying to scare me." His denial was a desperate, childish thing. He was like a boy who had broken a precious vase and was now trying to convince his parents that it had simply fallen on its own. He couldn't accept that his grand, clever scheme was built on a foundation of his own ignorance. He saw me as a relic, too old and sentimental to be capable of such foresight. That was his fatal mistake. "Think about it, Ryan," I said calmly, leaning forward slightly. "Did you really believe I would keep something of that value in a simple wooden chest in my bedroom? A chest you've known about since you were a child? I taught you better than that. I taught you that true value is always protected." My words were not an accusation. They were a lesson, the continuation of the one he'd abandoned with the sandpaper all those years ago. The lesson was about respect for the material, and he had failed it spectacularly. He jumped to his feet, his hands clenched into fists. "This is insane! You're making this up! You're just old! Maybe you're confused." The insult was meant to wound me, to throw me off balance, but it did the opposite. It solidified my resolve. He wasn't just greedy. He was cruel. He would tear me down to build himself up, a shoddy construction destined to collapse. The love I had felt for him, which had been curdling all afternoon, now felt like it had hardened into a cold, solid stone. I didn't flinch. I simply reached for the small, leather-bound ledger on the end table next to my coffee cup. My hands were perfectly steady as I opened it to a bookmarked page. I turned it around and pushed it across the table toward him. This is the receipt from the jeweler in Philadelphia, dated May 14th, 2014, for the creation of 5 replica pieces. And this, I added, pointing to a second document, is the most recent statement from the bank, confirming the contents of safe deposit box 713. The proof was there, in black and white, irrefutable. He stared at the papers, his face draining of all color. His eyes scanned the lines of text, but I could tell he wasn't really reading. He was seeing the wreckage of his brilliant plan, the sports car, the apartment, the trip to Europe, all of it dissolving into smoke. He had built a castle in the air, and I had just revealed it was nothing more than a cloud. The $80,000 he was so proud of was the result of a con, dearies, but he was not the con man. He was the mark. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't my calm, controlled silence anymore. It was the dead, empty silence of a vacuum. His arrogance had been sucked out of the room, leaving behind only the pathetic shell of a young man who had just discovered the true depths of his own foolishness. He sank back into the chair, the fight completely gone from him, his body looking deflated and small. For a fleeting moment, I felt a stab of pity, the ghost of the grandmother I used to be. But I pushed it down. Pity was a luxury I could no longer afford. Pity was what had allowed this to happen in the first place. My unwavering love had been a shield for his character flaws, and now that shield was gone. He needed to see the unvarnished truth of himself, just as I saw the raw wood beneath layers of cracked paint. This was not about punishing him. It was about restoration. The restoration of his character, if such a thing was even possible. The man who bought the jewelry. "He'll realize they're fakes," Ryan whispered, his voice hoarse. "He'll come after me. I could go to jail." The fear was finally dawning on him, the real-world consequences of his actions. He wasn't worried about betraying me, or destroying his family's legacy. He was worried about himself. The selfishness was so pure, so absolute. It was almost breathtaking. It was the final confirmation that I was doing the right thing. "Perhaps," I said, my voice neutral, "or perhaps he is a dishonest man himself, who will sell them on to some other unsuspecting fool. It is no longer our concern. What is our concern is what happens now, with you and with that money." I let the statement hang in the air, a clear turning point. I was taking control. The passive, grieving victim was gone. The matriarch, the protector of the Schneider legacy, was now setting the terms. His head snapped up, a desperate hope flickering in his eyes. "The money? I can give it back, Grandma. I'll give it all back to you. We can just pretend this never happened." He was bargaining now, trying to find the quickest way to erase his mistake, not to atone for it. He still didn't understand the nature of his crime. He thought it was about the $80,000. He couldn't grasp that the currency he had stolen was trust, and that was a debt he could never repay in cash. I gave a small, sad shake of my head. "No, Ryan. We can't pretend this never happened. You made a choice. You looked at your heritage, at the story of our family, and you put a price tag on it. You sold it for cash. Now, you have to live with that choice. The money is yours. You stole it. You earned it, in a manner of speaking." His eyes widened in disbelief. This was not the reaction he expected. He was prepared for anger, for lectures, for tears. He was not prepared for this cold, logical acceptance. A new kind of dread began to creep into his expression as he started to understand that this was not about forgiveness. What are you saying?" he stammered. "If you're letting me keep the money, then what's the catch?" He was a born transactional thinker. Everything had a price, a catch. He couldn't conceive of a consequence that wasn't monetary. He was about to learn that the most profound debts have nothing to do with dollars and cents. I folded my hands in my lap, my posture as straight and unyielding as the back of a shaker chair. "There is no catch, Ryan. There is only a consequence. You have chosen to liquidate your inheritance. You have exchanged your history for cash. So, you may keep the $80,000, but that is all you will ever receive from me. You are no longer a beneficiary of my will. You are no longer a part of this family's future." The words landed in the room with the finality of a gavel strike. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood had drained so completely from his face that he looked like a marble statue, a monument to greed and folly. He was finally seeing the true cost of his actions. It wasn't jail time or a financial penalty. It was exile. It was the severing of the one tie that he had taken for granted his entire life. He started to babble, the words tumbling out in a panicked, incoherent stream. He pleaded, he apologized, he promised to change. But the words were weightless, meaningless. They were the desperate promises of a caught thief, not the sincere repentance of a grandson. He was sorry he got caught, not sorry for what he had done. I had spent a lifetime restoring furniture, and I knew the difference between a surface-level polish and a deep, structural repair. His soul needed more than a polish. I listened patiently until he ran out of breath, his empty promises echoing in the quiet room. The storm had finally broken outside, and a soft rain began to patter against the window panes. It felt like the world was finally weeping for the loss I had been holding inside all afternoon. The house, my sanctuary, now felt like a courtroom, and I was both judge and jury, and I had just delivered the sentence. When he was finished, I spoke again, my voice soft but unbreakable. "I will have Mr. Albright draw up the new papers tomorrow morning. My estate, this house, its contents, and the real heirlooms will be left to the Lidditz Historical Society. They will know how to preserve our family's story. They will respect the material." This was the final, devastating blow. I was not just cutting him off. I was replacing him. The legacy he had despised would be given to strangers who would appreciate it. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a horror that was finally, horribly real. He was seeing his future, a future untethered from the security and history he had so carelessly discarded. He was seeing himself as I now saw him, alone, with a pocket full of dirty money and a past he had willingly incinerated. The proud, euphoric young man who had walked in a few hours ago was gone forever. A single tear finally traced a path down his cheek, but it wasn't a tear of remorse. It was a tear of self-pity. He was mourning his own loss, not the pain he had caused me. That single tear told me everything I needed to know. It confirmed the rightness of my decision, as painful as it was. Sometimes, the only way to save a legacy is to cut away the part that is rotten. I stood up slowly, my old bones aching with a weariness that went far beyond the physical. "The guest room is prepared. If you wish to stay the night, we can speak again in the morning, after you've had time to think. But my decision, Ryan, is final. It is as solid as the foundation of this house." I turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving him alone in the living room with the ghosts of his ancestors and the crushing weight of his $80,000 mistake. The turning point was complete. Our relationship was broken, but my spirit and my legacy were now secure. I walked into the kitchen not because I was hungry, but because it was an act of movement, a way to put physical distance between myself and the wreckage in the other room. The sound of the rain against the glass was the only thing I could hear over the blood pounding in my ears. I filled the kettle with water, my hands moving with the familiar grace of a lifetime of routine, even as my world tilted on its axis. I wasn't acting out of anger anymore. That had burned away, leaving behind a cold, desolate landscape. This was the first step into a new life, one I had just created with a few terrible sentences. The silence from the living room was an answer in itself, a vacuum where a family used to be. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I sat in my worn kitchen chair, sipping chamomile tea that tasted like dust, and listened to the house groan around me. Every creak of the floorboards upstairs sounded like a footstep, and I flinched, half expecting Ryan to appear in the doorway, his face twisted in remorse. But he never came. The hours ticked by on the old wall clock, each one a small metallic death knell for the grandmother I had been. I felt the immense weight of my decisions settle into my bones, a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical illness. This was the true cost, not the loss of a grandson, but the murder of the illusion I had so lovingly nurtured. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, I knew he was gone. I didn't need to check. The house felt hollowed out, its soul scooped clean. I walked back into the living room, and the sight of the empty armchair where he had sat, a cold coffee cup left on the end table like an artifact from another civilization, confirmed it. He had left in the night, taking his $80,000 and the last vestiges of my hope with him. There was no note, no final plea, just an empty space and the lingering, cloying scent of his cologne, a ghost of his betrayal that I knew I would have to scrub from the air. The silence he left behind was different from the peaceful solitude I had cherished for years. It was a jagged, aggressive silence, filled with unspoken accusations and the echoes of his cruel, proud words. For a moment, I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. What had I done? I had single-handedly dismantled my own family, cut the only remaining thread connecting me to the future. The 4 stone walls of my home, once my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a tomb. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone, and the path forward was a dark, unfamiliar forest. This was my first stumble, the moment my resolve wavered under the crushing weight of consequence. But then my eyes landed on a piece of furniture I was in the middle of restoring, a small cherry wood nightstand with a deep gouge across its top. I ran my hand over the scarred wood. My purpose, my skill, was to take what was broken and make it whole again. I couldn't fix Ryan, and I couldn't fix what he had done, but I could restore order to my own life. I walked to the sink, filled a bucket with warm, soapy water, and began to clean the house. I scrubbed away the lingering scent of his presence, a methodical, physical act of reclaiming my space, one small, deliberate motion at a time. It was the beginning of my own restoration. The next morning, I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Mr. Albright's office. My voice was steady, clearer than it had been in years. "Mr. Albright, it's Evelyn Schneider," I said, looking out the window at the hydrangeas, their heavy heads bowed from the rain. "I need to schedule an appointment as soon as possible. I am making immediate and permanent changes to my last will and testament." There was no hesitation in my words. The discipline I had applied to my craft for 40 years was now being applied to my life. I was no longer just preserving wood and varnish. I was preserving a legacy. Mr. Albright, a man who had known my family for 30 years, listened patiently on the other end of the line. His voice was laced with a gentle concern that I both appreciated and dismissed. "Evelyn, are you certain? This is a significant step. Perhaps we should discuss the reasons." But I cut him off, politely but firmly. "The reasons are my own, and my decision is final. I simply need you to execute the legal requirements." In that moment, I felt a shift inside me. I was no longer asking for permission or validation. I was giving instructions. The gentle, accommodating widow was being replaced by the unyielding matriarch. The drive into Lancaster felt different that day. The familiar rolling hills and tidy Amish farms of Pennsylvania Dutch country, usually a source of quiet comfort, seemed to hold a new meaning. I saw the legacy of the people who had worked this land, the generations of quiet, stubborn people who built things to last. I was one of them. My grandparents had laid the stones for my house with their own hands, and I was now laying the foundation for its future, ensuring it would be protected from the carelessness of a generation that didn't understand the value of things that couldn't be instantly converted to cash. Sitting in his stuffy, leather and mahogany office, I felt a strange calm. Mr. Albright laid the new documents on the polished desk between us, his expression a mixture of professional duty and personal sadness. I read every word, the legal jargon spelling out the end of one future and the beginning of another. When I picked up the heavy fountain pen to sign, my hand was as steady as if I were applying a final coat of wax to a priceless antique. The scratch of the nib on the thick paper was the only sound in the room, a definitive, irreversible punctuation mark at the end of a long and painful chapter of my life. Leaving his office, I didn't feel the triumph I might have expected. Instead, a profound sense of peace settled over me, layered with an enduring sadness. The act was done. The bridge was burned. I had protected my family's history, but I had lost my family's future in the process. It was a bitter trade, but a necessary one. As I drove home, I knew I was driving toward a life of true solitude, no longer buffered by the false hope I had placed in my grandson. The transformation was no longer just an idea, it was a legal reality, signed and sealed. The external conflict I had dreaded arrived 2 days later in the form of a hysterical phone call. It was my daughter, Sarah, Ryan's mother. He had obviously fed her a carefully edited version of the story, painting himself as the victim of a cruel, unfeeling old woman. "Mother, what have you done?" she shrieked, her voice thin and sharp with accusation. "Ryan told me everything. You've disowned him over some old dusty jewelry. How could you be so heartless? He's your only grandson. He's just a boy." The words were like tiny, sharp stones hurled through the phone line. Her phrase, "just a boy," ignited a cold fire in my gut. He was not a boy. He was a 22-year-old man who had committed a calculated act of theft and betrayal. But I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I let her storm of words wash over me, recognizing it for what it was, the panicked defense of a mother who had also been willfully blind for years. Her denial was a mirror of my own past foolishness, and seeing it so clearly now only strengthened my resolve. The new Evelyn did not engage in pointless battles. She stood on the firm ground of her decisions. Still, the internal conflict churned within me. As she yelled, a memory ambushed me. Ryan, age 5, his face streaked with chocolate, holding up a bouquet of dandelions he'd picked for me from the yard. My heart ached with a physical pang for the boy he had been, for the love I had felt for him, so pure and uncomplicated. For a fleeting second, the old me, the doting grandmother, wanted to apologize, to fix it, to promise anything to make the pain go away. It was a ghost whispering in my ear, tempting me back to the comfortable prison of my old life. I took a deep breath, anchoring myself in the present, in the quiet of my kitchen. "Sarah," I said, my voice low and even, cutting through her tirade. "This is not about the jewelry. This is about a betrayal of trust that can never be repaired. He made a choice to sell his heritage. I have made a choice to protect it. The conversation is over." Before she could respond, I gently placed the receiver back in its cradle. The silence that followed was my own. I had faced the judgment of my own child and had not broken. It was a painful, lonely victory. The finality of that conversation left me truly isolated. I was an island. The days that followed were a test. The quiet of the house was immense, and the temptation to fill it with regret was strong. Instead, I went to my workshop. I found an old secretary desk I had bought at an estate sale years ago, a beautiful piece that had been horribly neglected, its veneer peeling, its joints loose. It was broken and forgotten. It was the perfect project. It would become my salvation, a tangible focus for my grief and resolve. This was the next stage of my journey. I threw myself into the work with a singular focus I hadn't felt in years. The rhythmic scrape of the tool stripping away the cracked, yellowed varnish became a form of meditation. Each layer of old neglect I removed felt like I was stripping away my own layers of naivete and willful blindness. The scent of turpentine and sawdust filled my lungs, clearing my head of the lingering ghosts. In the workshop, there were no emotions, only problems to be solved with patience, skill, and an honest assessment of the material. The desk, like my life, had good bones. It just needed to be freed from what was hiding them. Slowly, a new rhythm took hold. I would wake with the sun, tend to my hydrangeas, their resilient blooms a daily reminder of nature's ability to endure. Then, I would spend hours in the workshop, losing myself in the meticulous process of sanding, gluing, and clamping. In the evenings, I played my father's opera records, the soaring arias filling the house, not with loneliness, but with a grand, beautiful melancholy. I was not happy, not yet, but I was purposeful. I was building something new from the wreckage of the old, both on my workbench and within myself. There were still moments of weakness. Sometimes, while sanding a delicate curve of wood, my mind would drift, and I would see Ryan's face. The ache would return, sharp and sudden. The fear that I had made a monstrous, unforgivable mistake would creep in. But then I would focus on the grain of the wood in front of me, on the simple, honest task at hand. I learned to acknowledge the pain without letting it consume me. I was learning to live with the scars, just as I had learned to repair the gouges in old furniture, making them a part of the history of the piece, not a reason to discard it. A month into my work on the desk, I achieved a small but significant breakthrough. I had been struggling to repair a drawer with a complex dovetail joint that had split. After days of careful work, it finally slid perfectly into place, the joint seamless and strong. I ran my hand over the smooth, flush surface and felt a surge of quiet pride. It was more than just a repair, it was a resurrection. It was proof that with enough patience and the right technique, even the most broken things could be made strong again. My confidence, so shattered by Ryan's betrayal, was slowly being rebuilt, one small victory at a time. An unexpected letter arrived one afternoon, its envelope crisp and unfamiliar. My heart seized, thinking it was from a lawyer representing the man who had bought the fake jewelry. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, but it wasn't a threat. It was from the buyer himself, a well-known and slightly notorious antiques dealer from Philadelphia. He wrote that while he was initially furious to discover the pieces were replicas, he had them examined by an expert and was so impressed by their craftsmanship that he wanted to know who had made them. It was a bizarre, unexpected validation of my foresight, a strange compliment from the world of sharks Ryan had tried to swim in. That letter prompted me to do something I had been avoiding. I drove to the bank in Lancaster, my new will safely filed away, and asked to see my safe deposit box. I needed to reconnect with the source of all this pain and resolve. I needed to remind myself what, exactly, I had been fighting for. The walk into the cold, silent vault felt like a pilgrimage. The bank clerk left me alone in the small private room, and I placed the heavy metal box on the table, my own history contained within its simple, rectangular form. With a deep breath, I turned the key and lifted the lid. There they were, nestled in faded velvet, the real heirlooms, the heavy gold locket, warm to the touch, the sapphire earrings that held the exact color of Arthur's eyes. They seemed to hum with a quiet energy, a power that had nothing to do with their monetary value. They were the distilled essence of my family's story, of love and hardship, of immigration and survival, of promises kept and legacies passed down. They were everything Ryan had failed to see. Holding my great-grandmother's locket in the palm of my hand, I felt the last vestiges of my doubt fall away. There was no grief, no regret, only a profound and unshakable sense of rightness. I had not been cruel. I had been a guardian. I had not destroyed my family. I had protected its very soul from desecration. I had honored the promise I made to Arthur and to all the generations that came before me. The weight that had been crushing my spirit for weeks finally lifted, replaced by a strength as solid and enduring as the fieldstone walls of my home. I closed the box, locked it, and returned it to the vault. I walked out of the bank and into the bright Pennsylvania sunshine, feeling lighter than I had in years. The world looked sharper, the colors more vibrant. The journey had been excruciating, a trial by fire that had burned away the weaker parts of me. I had been forced to confront the ugliest truths about the person I loved most, and about myself. But I had emerged from the flames not brittle and broken, but tempered and strong, like forged steel. Back home that evening, I stood in my living room. The restored secretary desk now occupied the corner where an old, unused table had once sat. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the rich, swirling grain of the cherry wood, its surface glowing with a deep, warm luster. It was beautiful, whole, and stronger than it had ever been. I caught my reflection in its polished surface. I saw the lines on my face, the silver in my hair, but my eyes were different. The soft, sorrowful gaze of the grieving grandmother was gone. In its place was the clear, steady gaze of a woman who knew her own worth and the worth of the legacy she was protecting. I was no longer the same person. I was a restorer, and I had finally restored myself. The months that followed were not a period of healing, but one of meticulous construction. My life before that fateful Sunday had been about preservation, about maintaining a delicate status quo. The life I built afterward was about creation. The finished secretary desk stood in my living room not as a piece of furniture, but as a monument to my own rebirth. Its cherry wood grain, deep and lustrous under layers of hand-rubbed oil, was proof that something scarred and neglected could be returned not just to its former glory, but to a state of profound, newly appreciated beauty. This tangible achievement was the first plank in the new foundation of my life. My days found a new, more vibrant rhythm. The quiet of the house no longer felt like a prelude to loneliness. It was the clean, clear space of a workshop, ready for the day's work. I began volunteering my skills at the Lidditz Historical Society, offering to restore pieces from their collection that had been deemed too far gone. The work was demanding, requiring a level of focus that left no room for regret. I was no longer just Evelyn Schneider, the quiet widow. I was a master craftswoman, a woman with a purpose that extended beyond the four walls of my home. My hands, once symbols of domestic care, were now instruments of resurrection. The contrast between the woman I was and the woman I had become was stark. The old Evelyn would have politely declined any request that took her too far from her routine, her world having shrunk to the size of her garden and her memories. The new Evelyn embraced the challenge. When the Historical Society asked if I could lead a small weekend workshop on basic furniture restoration, I agreed without hesitation. I stood before a group of 12 eager strangers, my voice clear and steady as I explained the difference between shellac and varnish. The quiet confidence I felt a foreign but welcome sensation. My transformation did not go unnoticed. People in town began to see me differently. At the farmer's market, a woman I'd known for years stopped me not to offer condolences for my solitude, but to admire a small, restored table she'd seen on display at the library. "Evelyn," she said, her eyes wide with a newfound respect. "I had no idea you had such magic in your hands." It wasn't magic. It was work. It was patience. It was the simple, honest labor of seeing the potential beneath the damage, a skill I was finally applying to myself. The external reactions were a strange and affirming echo of my internal changes. My daughter, Sarah, called again a few months later. Her tone was no longer shrill with accusation, but hesitant, almost bewildered. She had heard about my work with the Historical Society. "Mother," she said, the word now holding a note of distance, "you seem busy." It wasn't an apology, and I didn't expect one, but it was an acknowledgement. She was seeing a woman she didn't recognize, someone who no longer needed her, or anyone, to validate her existence. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Even Mr. Albright, my lawyer, commented on the change during a routine follow-up. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses, a small, curious smile on his face. "You carry yourself differently, Evelyn," he observed. "You've always been strong, but now you seem free." He was right. I had been freed from the heaviest burden of all, the obligation to be the person everyone expected me to be. The quiet, doting grandmother was a role I had played, and the costume had finally been put away for good. The most surprising reaction came from the antiques dealer in Philadelphia. He wrote to me again, this time with a formal business proposal. He had a client looking for someone with my specific skills to restore a collection of 18th century Pennsylvania Dutch furniture. He offered a generous fee, but more importantly, he offered his professional respect. The very man who had been the unwitting instrument of Ryan's con was now seeking me out for my genuine expertise. The irony was not lost on me. It was a perfect, closing circle. My intangible achievements were far more significant. The greatest conquest was over my own fear. For years, I had been afraid of being alone, a fear that had made me cling to a toxic relationship with my grandson. Now, I understood the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is a lack, a void. Solitude is a presence, the quiet, powerful company of oneself. I had finally learned to be in my own company and find it not just tolerable, but enriching. My relationship with the past was also transformed. Before, My memories were anchors, weighing me down in a sea of grief. Now they were sails. I could listen to my father's opera records and hear not just his absence, but the joy he had brought into my life. I could sit in Arthur's armchair and feel not the emptiness beside me, but the warmth of the 30 years we had shared. The ghosts of my house had ceased their haunting. They had become my quiet, supportive counsel. I recognized the path I had traveled. The woman who had sat in stunned silence as her grandson confessed his betrayal seemed like a different person. A fragile ancestor I remembered with a kind of distant pity. That woman had allowed her love to become a form of blindness. She had mistaken need for affection. The journey since that day had been a painful but necessary stripping away of that blindness, forcing me to see the unvarnished truth not just of Ryan, but of myself. One crisp autumn afternoon, I did something the old Evelyn would never have contemplated. I packed a small bag, locked the house, and drove to the Allegheny National Forest, a place Arthur and I had always planned to visit, but never had. For 3 days, I walked among ancient trees, their leaves a riot of gold and crimson. I breathed air that was clean and sharp, and I felt a sense of peace that was entirely my own, not borrowed from a memory or a person. I was building new memories for myself. This journey was the culmination of my transformation. I had learned that my life was not a museum of the past, to be curated and protected from the outside world. It was a workshop, a place of active, ongoing creation. My value was not in the heirlooms I possessed, but in the skill, wisdom, and resilience I embodied. It was a profound, liberating realization that settled deep in my bones, as solid and unshakable as the fieldstone foundation of my home. I never heard from Ryan directly again. I heard whispers through Sarah that the $80,000 had vanished quickly, spent on a flashy car that was soon repossessed and a lifestyle he couldn't sustain. He had learned nothing. The money had been a curse, not a blessing, because it was unearned. He had liquidated his past for a fleeting present and was now left with no foundation upon which to build a future. I felt a deep, abiding sorrow for him, the kind one feels for a beautiful piece of wood that has been hopelessly warped. My work with the Historical Society grew, and with it, my reputation. I started a small apprenticeship program, taking on 2 young people from the community who were eager to learn the craft, teaching them, passing on the skills my own hands had perfected over decades, felt like the truest form of legacy. It was a living inheritance, one of skill and respect, not of gold and jewels that could be sold to the highest bidder. This was the future of my family's story. The day came when the Historical Society hosted a reception to unveil several pieces I had restored. They asked me to say a few words. As I stood at the small podium, looking out at the faces of my neighbors and friends, I felt no nerves. I saw the restored furniture displayed around the room, glowing under the warm lights, their history and beauty made visible once more. They were a testament not just to my work, but to a deeper truth I had come to understand. I began to speak, my voice filling the quiet room. I didn't talk about techniques or types of wood. I talked about scars. I told them that the goal of restoration is not to erase the history of a piece, not to pretend the damage never happened. The goal is to integrate the scars, to make them a part of the story, a testament to the object's survival. A deep gouge, properly repaired, can become a mark of character, a sign of a life lived. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the people who had watched my own quiet restoration. "We are all, in a way, antique pieces," I said softly. "We collect scratches and dents and stains along the way. We get scarred by disappointment, by grief, by the carelessness of others. And we can choose to see ourselves as damaged goods, or we can choose to see ourselves as worthy of restoration." My reflection was clear. The path I had walked was not unique to me. Everyone in that room, everyone watching this story, had their own cedar chest of memories, their own heirlooms of the heart that they feared losing. And they all had their own scars, their own moments of betrayal or loss that had left a deep mark on the surface of their lives. The conquest was not in avoiding the damage, it was in picking up the tools and beginning the work. I thought about the contrast between the value Ryan saw and the value I had rediscovered. He saw value as something you could take, something you could liquidate for instant gratification. I had learned that true value is something you build, something you earn through patience, skill, and respect. It is the core of integrity that remains when everything else has been stripped away. That is the only inheritance that truly matters. The greatest conquest was not over my grandson. It was over the part of myself that had been afraid to live. By cutting him off, I had been forced to graft a new branch onto my own life, and it had blossomed in ways I could never have imagined. My world had not become smaller with my loss. It had expanded exponentially. I was more connected to my community, more engaged with my purpose, and more at peace with myself than I had ever been. The message I wanted to leave with them, and with you, was simple. Do not be afraid of your own scars. They are the proof that you have lived, that you have survived. Do not let anyone else define your worth. The most valuable things you will ever own are the skill in your hands, the wisdom in your heart, and the courage to restore yourself when you are broken. I ended my speech with a final thought on the nature of our legacy. It is not what we leave behind in boxes for others to appraise. It is the impact we have, the skills we share, the strength we model. It is the story told not by our possessions, but by the honest, resilient grain of our character, revealed for all to see. My name is Evelyn Schneider. I am 72 years old. I am not a victim. I am not a lonely widow. I am a restorer, and the most important project I have ever undertaken is my own life. I took what was broken, and I made it strong again, and that is a conquest no one can ever take away from me. So I ask you to look at your own life. Look at the scratches and the dents. Do not despair. Pick up your tools. Have patience. Respect the material. The honest wood is there, beneath it all, waiting for you. Begin the work. It is never too late to restore yourself.